So in this week, we will be starting with the capacity building workshop. Of course, you can start building your solution, and the capacity building workshop will be supporting you to ask your questions for any of our speakers, depending on the topic that we're sharing. So of course, don't rely on the capacity building workshop to finish them, then start building your solution, start from now. And while moving, ask your questions to the speaker and be curious. So today we have a really exciting talk with Denis. I'll be also the first time watching this talk, so I'm also really excited for the topic. Just quickly to introduce Denis, he's currently in Canada, and it's 8 a.m. So thank you, Denis, for waking up early just to share all the insights and your knowledge with our participants. So Denis will come from a background where he trained and consult companies about accessibility and how they can include maybe technical solutions into accessible into their companies. So I'll leave for Denis to introduce yourself more and to introduce maybe the talk and everything, so you can take it from here. And thank you so much for your time.
All right, thank you. Welcome. Thanks, everyone. Hello, Rabab. So one of my friends is here as well. So Rabab Goma is here from Ottawa. So she's actually farther to Lebanon than I am now. So she got me beat. Yeah, welcome. So we have about an hour together. Oh, hold on. There's some echo on my end. Okay, good. So about an hour together. You may have seen the outline. Generally speaking, my goal today is to walk you through an introduction of what digital accessibility is about, and hopefully help inspire you to want to make a change and create a more inclusive world for everyone, including people with disabilities. That's the goal. Normalizing a lot of the information around disability so that we all share a better understanding of all the good that we can bring by being aware of the challenges, the gaps, and what we can do to minimize those gaps. And I thought that I would begin the session by sharing a little bit about myself from when I was a kid. So when I was in third grade, around 8 or 9 years old, is when I discovered that I was not like the other kids. And the way that I discovered that was rather, I guess, uncommon. So we were sitting in geography class, some random day in spring of, I want to say 1979, maybe it's 1980, something like that. And we have an exam that day, geography exam. And the exam is pretty simple. We have a map of Canada, and we have to draw every province with its own color. And the teacher has these instructions in place, and she's saying, okay, so each province has a specific color. So she tells us what the colors are. British Columbia is going to be brown, and then Alberta is going to be green, and so on and so forth. So every 10 provinces has their own color, and we're being tested as to whether or not we know which province is which by being able to assign the right color to each province. And I studied really hard for that test, and I really know every one of those provinces and where they are. And one of the main reasons why I know them so well is because in my class was a really, really cute girl that I really wanted to impress. So I studied really hard to make sure that she would notice how smart I was. Her name was Julie, and I really wanted to impress her. So I studied really hard for this. So we go and do the exam, and I'm coloring every single color, every single province with the right colors. And I'm like, I know this really well. And then we come back from recess after the exam, and then the teacher gives us the results. And I failed almost every color, almost every province. I have like 2 out of 10. But I really thought that I knew my colors. And so I asked, I raised my hand, and I don't understand, like, why is it that I only have 2 out of 10? Like, I know every one of them. And the teacher says, well, clearly you did not study because you got them all wrong. You weren't very good. And I get all frustrated and like tearing a little bit and humiliated and everything. And then I tell, no, that's not true. And you said that, British Columbia needed to be brown, and then I take my brown crayon and I put it up, and then you said Alberta needed to be green, and then take that one out, and then kids around me start laughing, and I don't understand why, and I get even more frustrated, even more humiliated, And then kids start saying, hey, he doesn't even know what green is. He doesn't even know what brown is. And so they start making fun of me. And it sort of escalates that way. And, I've always been a little combative. So, push back, and I end up being, pushed away from the class. And then I find my way into the nurse's office, and she speaks to me, and she asks me questions, and then she takes out a book, and the book has these circles in it with a bunch of different colored circles in them. And she asks me whether I can see the number in each of the circles, and I can't. I don't really see anything in there. Like, I just see bubbles of color. And then she informs me that I'm colorblind. And I didn't know that. Up until that point, I was like 8 or 9 again. That never occurred to me. And so that day I discovered, through humiliation, through frustration, through lack of support from my teacher, clearly, that I was different from other kids. And I think that is one of my origin stories around accessibility, is the understanding of how it feels to be different, how it feels to be excluded from something, and how it feels to not belong in a way. So I want to ask you, if you go back in your own memory, can you point to a specific moment in time where you remember feeling excluded? You remember feeling different? You remember feeling not welcomed? And if you can, would you mind sharing a word in chat that would capture that feeling? Like, how did being excluded make you feel? If you want to drop that in chat for me, just one word, like what the first word that comes to mind when you think about exclusion. Give you a couple of seconds to do that. So frustrated, ashamed, lonely. Anything else? Depressed. So I'm half Asian in my country. I'm very experienced with this. Yeah, you and I both. Powerless, afraid, words like that. Okay, so that's good. So thank you for sharing those. The reason why I'm asking you this is very simple. As I'm going to be going through this content today with you, I want you to keep in mind those words and what they mean, because for people with disabilities, the words that you are using there, I'm seeing more words now: misunderstood, reduced self-confidence, invaluable, things like that. These words very much describe how people with disabilities feel every single day when they're using the web, because the web is not made for them. The web is not accounting for their needs and expectations. And as a result of that, every single day as they're going on websites, they are reminded that they're different from everybody else. And we have the power to change that by educating ourselves about accessibility, by understanding how to make changes in the way that we develop websites, the way that we design websites, the way that we speak with our vendors. If we're not part of the web development or web design process ourselves, but we are managing it, because some of you are probably doing that, what we can do to make sure that accessibility is being taken care of, so that people don't have to feel the way that you've been describing with these words in chat. So usually, of course, when I present this material, I present it to North Americans, sometimes Europeans. So the data that I have is usually pretty North American centric, if not US centric. So I did a little bit of research for today and try to work with Lebanon numbers instead, just to help you maybe contextualize it a little bit more in your part of the world. So we'll get to that in a minute. Before we do, I want to sort of set the stage for what we're talking about. Web accessibility, digital accessibility might not be something that you're completely clear about. Might not be something that you understand all that much. So let me put it into a couple words that make a lot of sense to me, and hopefully it will make a lot of sense to you as well, because there are a lot of different definitions for what accessibility is. And Google is full of examples of such definitions. But to me, it really boils down to a very simple concept, which is usable by anyone on any device. So of course, when we say that your content should be usable by anyone, we of course mean people with disabilities first and foremost. I mean, that's the core of who we're doing this for. But it's also much broader than that. And through the next 40 some minutes or so, my goal is to build a bit of a business case around this for you to understand how much broader it reaches when we do this well. So people with disabilities first, yes, but as we'll see, aging populations, our seniors also benefit very much from accessibility. Anyone who comes from a different cultural background, for instance, is disabled in that particular context. Imagine, for instance, if I flew down to Beirut, for instance, and I had to try to get information in Arabic, I'd be at a loss. I mean, I speak French, I speak English, but that's it. So I mean, I'm sure there's a lot of English around in Lebanon, but I would be missing on some information culturally because I can't speak Arabic. So, beyond the idea of making things work for someone who's blind or someone who's deaf, there are other considerations that also make it easier for people who don't speak the language, for instance. And also, anyone who's marginalized by technology one way or another. It might be that your equipment is not working the way that it should right now. It might be that you have a temporary issue. Maybe you sprained your wrist, or you broke your arm and you can't use that mouse, and now you need to rely on your keyboard more. Now, any of these situations might make it easier for you if the content that you're looking at is accessible. So when we say usable by anyone, we really mean anyone. And then on any device there's just as much to unpack there, because when you think about devices, of course, what we usually think about, are keyboards, tablets, mobile devices, that sort of thing. But what we also mean, and you'll have at least another presentation this week on Wednesday by Rabab and Tufik, who are both from Ottawa here in Canada. And they'll be talking about tools, for instance. So screen readers is one of those tools, Assistive Technologies. So when we say any devices, we mean computers, we mean tablets, we mean mobile devices in general, but we also mean assistive technologies used by people with disabilities to accommodate them and allow them to be able to use the content. So if you're not really familiar with assistive technologies, let me give you a couple of examples here. So I mentioned a screen reader. A screen reader is a piece of technology, it's a piece of software that someone who's blind, someone who has a cognitive disability might run to be able to listen to the website instead of having to look at it. For someone who's blind, of course, it's pretty obvious why they would want to do that. If you can't see the screen, there's not even a point to having a monitor. There's no point in having a mouse if you can point and click. So you're going to rely on your keyboard and you're going to maneuver around the interface so that you can be read the content linearly. So that allows you to understand what the content is about. If you're building a website and you think about your website as being this very visual experience, and you don't provide the right hooks into your code, into your design, so that the assistive technology can translate the visual presentation into something that makes sense structurally speaking, someone who's blind cannot use that site. It would not make sense. If your site asks me to, for instance, click on the button on the left, and I'm blind, I don't know where the left is. All I know is the content that comes before and after what is currently being read on that page. So that does not help me. Or if I bring it back to me, if you ask me to click on the red button or the green button, chances are they look pretty much the same to me, and I don't know which one is which. So when your copy is presented that way,
Sorry.
so when your content is presented that way, you're leaving people out as a result of that. So part of the hold on a second, let me just see if I can mute that person. Oh, okay, I think we got it. Thank you. Yeah, so when we're able to address the needs in that particular way, then we hold on a second. Let me just try to fix that. Okay, I think we're good. Okay. Anyway, the idea being that if your content is really presented in a visual manner, then it makes it more difficult for some people to use it. So assistive technologies, screen readers are an example of that. Another example might be someone using a voice recognition software. So let's say that I'm paralyzed from the neck down, I'm quadriplegic, I can't really use my hands, I can't use my legs. So using a mouse, of course, is not going to work, but using a keyboard is not going to work either in my case, because I just don't have enough mobility to be able to do that. So, so what I might use instead is what we call a voice recognition software. One such example, a very popular one, is called Dragon Naturally Speaking, and it basically allows you to use voice commands to control your computer. So you're going to be looking at the website, for instance, and you're going to say, click purchase button, assuming that there's a button called purchase on your website. And if the code behind the button actually uses the word purchase, I'm going to be able to trigger that button using my voice. If the code that's behind the website does not match the visual presentation, and I'm calling on the visual elements on the screen to control them, it's not going to work for me. So as you hopefully can see with these examples, the web is much more than a visual experience. It's both a visual and a programmatic experience, meaning that you have to program some structure, some hierarchy in some semantics, some meaning into this interface, so that it can be translated from a visual experience to one that can be then tapped into by an assistive technology, by a piece of software, for instance. So going back to my definition, usable by anyone on any device, you see that beyond people with disabilities, we're talking about a lot of people, and we're talking about a lot more than just a computer or a tablet, for instance. So that's kind of what I mean by digital accessibility in this case, web accessibility, native mobile accessibility, any accessibility in the digital space is what we're talking about. Now, I started talking a little bit about people with disabilities, so let's go down that path a little bit and explore that a bit more. So for instance, when it comes to someone who has a visual impairment, well, actually let's backtrack a little bit. So there are 4 main categories of disabilities when we think about accessibility, and in recent years it actually has expanded into a couple more. But so I started with accessibility in the summer of 2000, so it's been 23 years now. And back then, we really were only talking about these 4 main categories, which were visual, auditory, mobility, and cognitive. But and that was already quite a big challenge. In more recent years, we started having other types of challenges that came around with the advancement of technology. As an example, when we started having a lot more animations or movement on our websites, then we started realizing that some people were being triggered by too much animation. People were getting dizzy. People were getting nauseous even because there was just too much movement on the screen. And then we discovered that vestibular disorders, disorders in terms of your balance in your inner ear that causes you to feel dizzy or just vertigo kind of thing, could actually be triggered using a website. I mean, up until that point, you would expect to be triggered if you were going on a like a ride, for instance, or if you're reading in a car, for instance, or maybe on a boat, you get seasick, that sort of thing. I mean, that's where this vestibular disorders used to be common. It's now become pretty common in usability testing with people who have disabilities to identify people who need to stop the testing that they're doing at some point because they just don't feel well, because there's just too much movement going on the screen. That was a revelation to us around maybe 2013, 2014 or so. And then in more recent years, something else came up. I mean, you're all familiar, I'm sure, at least to a certain extent, with augmented reality, virtual reality. I mean, these new ways to consume information, to put together information, introduce new challenges again for someone with a disability. I mean, how do you create a VR experience for someone who's blind? Like, how do you do that? How do you create an augmented reality experience where you have additional items being layered in front of you in your headset, if you're someone who again is blind or has difficulty with movement or fine motor skills, for instance. These things are going to be a lot more complicated. So as we advance with technology, as industry advances and skills get better, you would think that accessibility gets easier and easier. And to a certain extent, it does. I mean, these things that we've been talking about for 25 years, they're pretty well understood by those who understand them, and they need to be learned by those who don't yet. So there's always new people to bring in, but it also gets more complicated because of these new technologies and the challenges that come with that. So what are some of those challenges? So like I said, blindness, for instance, is an example. I mean, the whole visual spectrum of disabilities is one such example where, when you think about someone who's completely blind, like I said, using a mouse, using a computer, pointing and clicking, it's pointless, pun intended. But it's a very different experience than if you're someone who has low vision, for instance. Let's say or someone who has a visual disease or challenge. And there's a lot of different examples of that. You can have glaucoma, you can have amblyopia, you can have cataracts, you can have macular degeneration. Like, all these different issues with your vision are going to affect what you can see and the extent to which you can see. So if you can't rely on your sight all that much, what else do you have to be able to use that content on the web or in a digital space? If you have very low vision and you need magnification, that's another type of assistive technology, right? Screen magnification, where when doing Control+ on your browser is no longer enough to make the size of the font big enough for you to read, then other tools can come in and help you zoom in on very specific areas of the screen, which allow you to see them. But then you're so focused, you no longer see the bigger picture. That gives you another problem, because most of us who don't require those tools, when we look at an interface, we look at it globally, holistically, and we get a sense of how things are organized, and then we zoom in on something. But if all you can do is zoom in to begin with, and you have to navigate and find your way around the interface only by being very zoomed in, you don't get that eye-level perspective. You don't understand how everything is organized. That makes it more complicated for you. It might not be that you have a hard time reading the information because you can make it the size that you want, but you have a harder time understanding the bigger picture. That's another kind of challenge that we need to think about. And then, of course, at the other end of that visual spectrum is color blindness. So folks like me who, when you ask them to notice the error message that's in red underneath the text field and all the content around it is in dark gray, I'm sorry, but for me, red and dark gray are pretty much the same most days. Lighting might help a little bit, but other than that, if all the information that you have is conveyed through the use of color only, I'm going to miss out on that. People like me are going to miss out on that. And when I say people like me, what I mean in this case is, statistically speaking, we're talking about 10% of men and 1 woman out of every 200. So 0.5% of women are colorblind. It's a significant population. In Lebanon, for instance, population is around 6.74 million. So, if we agree that about half of the population is male and the other half is female, then that gives us what? Around 3.5, well, not 3.3 million people, for instance, that might identify as men. 10% of that would be colorblind. So that's 337,000 or so. My math is not that great, but you get the idea, right? So 10% of half of your population deals with the situation every single day. It's a significant number of people. So visual impairments is challenges like these. If we think about auditory challenges, someone who struggles with hearing, again, the gamut is pretty large, from someone who has a little bit of a hard time hearing to someone who's hearing impaired, hard of hearing, and then someone who's completely deaf. And then for those who are completely deaf, there's a difference between someone who was born deaf and someone who became deaf over the course of their experience, their life. All of these things are going to condition how they're able to use the content. Someone who became deaf, completely deaf over the course of their life, they heard at some point, they understand communication from that standpoint. And that's very different than someone who was born deaf, who understands communication in a different way. American Sign Language, which, I mean, it's what we use in Canada as well. I don't know if this was being used in Lebanon or in the Middle East in general for English. Maybe it is. But there are dozens and dozens of different versions of sign language based on culture, based on language. If that is your first language, if that's your mother tongue, it's very different in terms of construct than English or French or Arabic, for instance. So when you're trying to understand written content as someone who never heard and who learned maybe English as a second language or a third language, you have more of a problem doing that. It's not as obvious because the construction of the language is different to begin with. And that's a lot of words to process. It's not just a matter of, someone who has a cognitive disability, maybe is dyslexic, struggling. It's also the ability to really understand the ideas when they're part of these longer sentences, bigger paragraphs, bigger pages of content. It makes processing information that much more complicated. So, and we typically don't think about that. When we think about someone who's deaf, what we think about is, oh yeah, okay, we need to put captions on our videos, and hopefully we need to put transcripts on our audio files, because otherwise they won't be able to hear that content. But what people don't realize is that for a lot of people who are hearing impaired, deaf or hard of hearing again, being able to read information is also a challenge in its own way, which is why you'll hear a lot of people advocating for sign language, even on more than just video, for instance. And then we can think about mobility impairments, different types of mobility disabilities. And in that particular case, again, you might have someone who is completely paralyzed, and like I said, might use their voice or might use eye tracking software to control a virtual keyboard on the screen. That's pretty extreme in terms of the experience of using technology to access information online. But this is something that is not all that uncommon when it comes to someone who is unable to use their upper limbs, for instance, for navigation. A little less uncommon approach would be that voice recognition software, voice detection software, as opposed to eye tracking, for instance. And then a bit more common even would be the idea that you're going to be relying on your keyboard instead of your mouse. Now, of course, if you are unable to use that mouse for whatever reason, the keyboard is an amazing fallback, because every single piece of technology that's out there that is meant to accommodate someone with a disability pretty much works with the underlying understanding that it works with the same sort of parameters as a keyboard does. So if you create your web experience, your online experience, with the idea of making it work well with a keyboard, then someone using, say, a screen reader will have a much better experience doing that. Someone using that voice dictation software will have a better experience as well, so on and so forth. So one of the underlying principles of accessibility is really creating something that works well with your keyboard. And if we had a bit more time, or if we were in a workshop together, for instance, what I might have you do right now, and you might want to try that out as I'm speaking to you, or maybe later today, but just go to any of the websites that you really know well, and try to use that website without that mouse, without your trackpad, just using your keyboard, using your tab key, your arrow keys, your enter key, your space bar, your escape key. These are all the keys that you need, and try to navigate through that site and see how successful you are. Chances are you're going to find out that it's pretty tough. And most websites aren't built for that, which means that most websites don't even meet the basic requirements for accessibility today in 2023. And it's easy enough for anyone who doesn't have any accessibility knowledge to identify these things just by knowing what I just told you. If you try to navigate just using your tab key, let's say, for instance, you go to that website, you click anywhere on that screen, and then you start hitting tab, and you see where you land, or you'll see whether or not you can even see where you land as you're going from one active object to the other in that page. And if the order in which you access them is logical or even intuitive, or whether or not you're skipping over things that are clearly meant to be clickable but are just not being triggered when you're using your keyboard, you'll notice a lot of gaps that way. And we're talking about companies that invest millions of dollars every year into their websites. It's not a lack of money, it's a lack of awareness. It's a lack of understanding what this is about. because, most companies have a pretty solid QA team that makes sure that everything is perfect. And, they spend hours and hours pointing and clicking on everything to make sure it works well. But then when you just step aside a little bit and you look at it from a different angle, you realize that as soon as you drop that mouse and you start navigating with the keyboard instead, everything pretty much falls apart. And, those leaders in these companies are mortified when someone like me comes in and shows them just how broken the website is for anyone who doesn't fit the mold of the average user, which is an entire myth that we could debunk if we have time today, among other things. But right now, the question is around disabilities, right? So hopefully you see how someone with a mobility disability can struggle in ways that are very different than someone who's deaf or someone who's blind, as an example. And then we get into the whole cognitive area, which used to be pretty straightforward before, when everything was into that one bucket of cognitive, which would include things like learning disabilities like dyslexia or dysgraphia, dyscalculia, and so on and so forth, and then ADHD and autism spectrum and traumatic brain injuries, like all these different things that you might think about. And now it became a bit more complex with a rather new concept these last couple of years of neurodivergence, where a group of cognitive disability, that things that used to be cognitive disabilities before, are now seen as this other aspect where people are not claiming a disability as much as a different wiring of the brain, to which I buy into that personally. Someone who has ADHD doesn't have a disability per se. What they have is a different way of approaching and seeing the world. That way of seeing and approaching the world creates a different experience for them with its strengths and weaknesses, just like we all have strengths and weaknesses. And someone who's dyslexic, same kind of thing. I mean, typically these weaknesses are compensated by other strengths in other areas, and these folks bring in different perspectives and different strengths that are complementary to a team, for instance. So anyway, when you look again at cognitive disabilities as a whole, and you're thinking about, say, someone who has a traumatic brain injury, and their challenge is sustaining concentration for a long time or remembering things, it's a very different challenge than someone who's dyslexic, for example. Because if you're dyslexic, your challenge, your main challenge is going to be being able to read and process what you're reading and remember what you're reading, and making sense of it as you're reading it. It's a lot more hard to do that. If you're someone with ADHD, you might not have a problem with reading content or understanding content. What your problem is, or your challenge is staying focused on that task and not following the next shiny object that comes in your view, and then forgetting what you were supposed to do in the first place. So all these things are very different again. And then, like I said at the beginning, other newer considerations like, say, vestibular disorders, where someone might not have an issue with anything until there's too much content that's moving on the screen, or someone with a photoepileptic sensitivity who might get triggered, have a seizure when there's too much content that's flashing on the screen. Or again, another example of how new technology brings in new challenges, someone with a speech impairment, or someone with an accent, for instance. I'm French speaking, I have an accent in English. So when I'm using different pieces of technology, like, say, Alexa or Siri, or all these assistants, for instance, they don't understand me all the time. And with captions, automatic captions, transcripts, as in a session like this, for instance, the words that it picks up as to what I'm saying are not always accurate. I mean, what that means is, if you're someone with, if you don't speak or enunciate words in the way that is expected by the technology, chances are these tools are harder for you to use. If you build an interface, if you build a product, and the whole idea is that someone is going to be speaking to the technology to use it, by definition, you're excluding people from that experience. And we're going back to all these words that you use at the beginning, powerless, misunderstood, all these different words that were there, that basically make you feel less than. And we're back to me in third grade realizing that, oh, okay, I'm not like everybody else. There's something wrong about me, something broken about me. So disabilities, very broad, right? Like a lot of different things that we can think about. And it can be very, daunting for someone who's trying to build accessibility into their content, having to think about all these different challenges. And again, in the presentation on Wednesday with Rabab and Tufik, they're going to talk a little bit about a standard called the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines, so WCAG, WCAG for short. Going to touch on it a little bit today, just to give you a glimpse of what that is, but I don't want to steal their thunder, so I'm not going to go that far into that particular area. But I at least want to share you a couple pointers to help you, I guess, de-dramatize the complexity of this, because it's not all that complicated after all. So the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines come from the W3C. So that's the World Wide Web Consortium, where all these standards are created for the web, for accessibility in particular. The ones that we're talking about are about accessibility. And you can think, I guess you can think of it as, you can think of W3C as Switzerland for accessibility. That's where everybody else meets in a neutral area, or supposedly neutral area, because of course politics get in the way all the time, but in this supposedly neutral area, and then they discuss what is best, what would be best in terms of accessibility accommodations, in terms of design and development practices to make the web more accessible to everyone. So the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines have been around since 1999. We're now on the third iteration of that standard today. Since 2018, we are working with WCAG 2.1, version 2.1. Before that, we had version 2.0, and before that, we had version 1.0. So over the course of 19 years, we went from WCAG 1 to WCAG 2.1. Over the last 4 or 5 years, the W3C has been working on version 2.2, which should be coming out, a couple months now. I mean, we've been thinking it would be coming out pretty much now for like a year at this point. So it is coming very quickly. And basically the standard sort of builds up on itself. I mean, it just adds new things to consider because, like I said earlier, new technology come in and new challenges are being discovered, and we need solutions for those things. So it's an evolving standard in that sense, and it allows you to understand, as a developer, as a designer, as a content creator, as a QA tester, as anyone part of a cross-functional team, to build accessibility into what you're doing, into your process, into your products and services. You may have heard of WCAG 2.0 or 2.1. In terms of legislation in Lebanon, you have law number 220, which is about accessibility, that does not speak to WCAG per se, but speaks to accessibility, access to an inclusive environment for employment, for instance. So unlike, say, the US or Canada, where we have laws that are very specifically saying your websites need to be accessible or else, there doesn't seem to be anything like that in Lebanon today, but you at least have this lever with law number 220 that basically speaks to accessibility. And I guess that through that, the point could be made that if you have a website, for instance, and you're hiring people through that website, and the website is not accessible, that you're failing the idea of that law, because it's impossible to work for you if that's the process to get to work in your place of business. But anyway, what I'm trying to get to here is that this standard, WCAG, Web Content Accessibility Guidelines, has 3 levels of conformance. So again, if you have heard of WCAG 2.0 or WCAG 2.1, you probably also heard of something like level A or level AA or level AAA. And what that means basically is pretty simple. Every level encompasses the previous level. So level A, as I forget the number now, I want to say 30 different rules that are part of that level A. If you go to level AA, it means those 30 rules plus another 20 rules, so 50 rules total. And if you go at level AAA, you add another 28 rules to that, and you get to 78 total. So depending on the level that you support, you have so many different things to think about. Like I said, accessibility at W3C is very political. What that means, among other things, is that the better your representation, the more likely you will be accommodated in the standard. And what that means, in essence, is that because lobbies are much more powerful and much more organized among folks with visual disabilities, for instance, or even deafness, you have a lot more support for those considerations at level AA. So level A and AA together, so they're better represented. And, mobility as well. The areas that are typically less represented are low vision and cognitive disabilities. And a lot of what the requirements are for those folks actually live at level AAA, which is a problem because for most organizations, if not all of them really, the baseline is drawn at level AA. Level AA is where people say, this is where we draw our line, this is our scope, so this is what we work on. Anything above that, we're not going to look into. And people have this false sense of security that because they're meeting level AA, for instance, that they have an accessible website. What they have is a website that is compliant, well, maybe compliant, that actually tries to be compliant with level AA, but it does not account for all these other things that other people with disabilities need. So, a lot of people are still left out as a result of that. A lot of people still feel excluded in all these things, even when you hit a level AA with your website. So the solution for that is really to go a little beyond the idea of what WCAG requires, which you could identify as universal accessibility, because you have this one version of your website following these universal rules, if you will, and it creates a one-size-fits-all experience where most people are going to be able to use the website successfully. And the key word here is most people, because some people will always slip through the cracks as a result of that. The only way that you can create an experience that will really be accessible to everyone is approaching it from like the angle of an inclusive design approach, where you use this standard WCAG, WCAG, as a baseline, and then you are in constant contact with your audience and you learn from them. And when you hear about something that is required, that is not part of your scope, you build it into what you're doing so that you involve more people into the creation. A very simple example of that might be considering your copy. Everything about reading language is at level AAA in that standard, which means that for most people, it's not part of what they're doing. But anyone who is dyslexic, anyone who was born deaf, anyone who's not a native speaker will struggle with your content if it's too complex. Anyone who doesn't have a high level, a higher education is likely to struggle with your content because, again, data here is North American, so bear with me, but it looks as though it's pretty standard across Europe. So I'm assuming Middle East is going to be similar in that sense. But the average reading level of people in North America is around the age of 13, 14, 15 maybe, which basically aligns with grade 8th or 9th. Grade 8th or 9th. That's not university level at all. It's not postgraduate level at all. If you look at the content on websites, it's typically more complex than that. And the reason why it's more complex is because those who write the copy are much more educated typically. So they write according to their skills, but their skills does not reflect what the rest of the population actually has in terms of ability to read content. So there's a dichotomy there between those who write and those who read, those who provide information and those who need it. There's a dichotomy between the two. And for most people, this is not part of their scope at all. But it's a pretty significant one when you think that, again, in North America, more than 50% of the population has that level of reading. Anything above that, they're going to scan really quickly, and that's all they're going to really be doing. They're not going to appreciate every single word that you put into the content, and they might miss out on what you're talking about. So your ability to communicate effectively is directly impacted by the complexity of the content that you put out there. If only we were looking into that particular consideration, more people would be using the websites and less people would be trying to get a hold of you on the phone because they don't understand what they're supposed to do with that while filling out that form or doing that other thing that you're asking them to do. So all these things are also about accessibility. And yeah, and then when we look at I haven't really talked about prevalence, but let's go there for a little bit. So again, in North America, when we think about people with disabilities, we think about 26% of the population. In the US, a little bit more than 1 out of every 4 people has a disability, 26%. In Canada, it's 22%. Across Europe, it's around 20-ish, 20, 21, 22% as well. When it comes to Lebanon, based on the data that I could find, the number seems to be around 10 to 15%, which honestly, respectfully, I kind of doubt, because it all depends on how we're measuring whether someone is a disability or not. And I think that if the criteria were a little broader, or if people were being asked to self-identify, these numbers would be higher and it would reflect other numbers around the world. But from the metrics of the UN, for instance, it still speaks to 16% of the population. And to Jihad's point, we don't talk much about that here, arguably. Yeah, I mean, in North America, for instance, a lot of people wear their disability as a, not a badge of honor, but you know what I mean, as a distinct part of who they are, their person. I'm going to assume that in your culture, it might not be something that people want to talk about all that much. So people keep that for themselves. And I understand that and definitely respect that, but it does create a problem, and that's a problem of representation. When we see 10 to 15% in your country, and we see 16% around the world, the Middle East is not the only area in the world where people are going to be protective of that information about themselves. They're not going to disclose that out of fear of being cast aside or judged or thought less than or anything like that. But what that does is people don't think that these disabilities are out there. And even in the US, where people are pretty vocal about these things, with 26%, the reality is that most people don't encounter people with disabilities every single day, even though theoretically 1 out of every 4 person has a disability. And the reason why that is, and that is going to be the same in Lebanon or anywhere around your part of the world, is that roughly 80% of disabilities are invisible. So if you have, say, let's say 10%, because 10% is an easy number to work with. Big round number. So let's say you have 10% of people who have disabilities in your country. That would mean roughly 674,000 people in the country, 10% roughly, would have a disability. That would mean that 80% of those 674,000 people have a disability that you cannot identify by simply looking at them. Which basically means what? If you take 674 times 2, roughly 13, maybe like 1.3 million people would easily be identified as having a disability. All the other ones go completely unnoticed. So when you think about, like, should we do this? Should we think about this? Is this even a question to wonder about? Of course, most people are going to say, well, not really. I mean, I saw one blind guy 4 weeks ago. I mean, that's the only person that I saw. And yet you would not know that every single day working with you is someone who is dyslexic, someone who is on the autism spectrum, someone who is colorblind, someone who has a hard time hearing, someone who has low vision. Like, you would not notice those things because all you can really see or spot when you look are people in a wheelchair, people with a service dog or a white cane, maybe sometimes someone with a cochlear implant. If their hair is shaved, then you can see it. But besides that, most others go unnoticed. And as a result of that, it's not something that people think about all that much. But the reality is that the number is much larger than we realize. And then if you add on top of that, because I said at the beginning that I would be making that business case, building that business case a little bit. So you have this piece about people with disabilities, but then our aging population, anyone over the age of 65, whether they like it or not, whether they want to admit it or not, they're pretty much on the spectrum of disability as well. I mean, your hearing is not as good as it used to be. Your vision is not as good as it used to be. Your ability to process information for a longer period of time, to sustain a concentration for a longer period of time, all those things are affected by aging, as is your mobility, your dexterity, your fine motor skills, and all these different things. So when you think about all the different categories that I've mentioned for accessibility, for disabilities, all these things over time become something that we all develop. The question is, as you get older, which one of those categories or disabilities will you major into? mean, I know, like I'm 52. So when I was around 45, I noticed that it was probably time to get glasses. And around the age of 48, 49, it was like, oh, I think my hearing is not as good as it used to be. And, I can blame heavy metal music or other things like that for that when I was a kid. But the reality is I don't hear as well as I used to. And I'm only 52. What's that going to look like when I'm 65? What's that going to look like when I'm 80 if I live that long? So of course, I might not identify myself as someone having a hearing impairment, but I'm definitely not hearing perfectly well. And that has an impact on my ability to hear listen to a video in an environment that's noisy. It has an impact on my ability to read something on a slide. If someone is presenting to me in a room and I'm sitting in the far back, I probably won't be able to read what's on that slide, or it's going to be, fuzzy at best, blurry at best. All those things, and I might not consider myself to have that disability, but the fact is I struggle. So my point here is that when you think about the senior population in Lebanon, we're thinking roughly, according to the UN, the UN development program, roughly 910,000 people in Lebanon are over the age of 65. So a little less than a million, arguably. And then if you combine the population of people with disabilities and then people that are older, it roughly comes up to 1.6 million people. And that basically is 22% of your population that benefits from accessibility. And that is a conservative number because, as some of us have agreed in chat and through this conversation, not everybody comes forward with this. So even with that reservation, we can still make a case for about 1% out of 5 in your country needing this to be able to fully participate in society. And if we don't have it, those folks cannot contribute to the extent that they could otherwise. And you're missing out on that talent. You're missing out on that information, these ideas, these contributions, and all the other things that we get from this. So that's kind of the idea of what I wanted to share with you today. I totally understand that it might not be something that people talk about. My wish for you is that over time it becomes easier as a conversation, and then it becomes more recognized and people get more support that way. Because by doing that, then what you get ultimately is a population that does not leave as many people behind, and you get a richer contribution from everyone, and this contributes to your growth as a population, you contribute to your growth as a society, and it speaks to values that would make people feel powerless or unneeded or ashamed or all these rejected, all these different words we used at the beginning. So to wrap this up, and I saw a couple of questions that I want to get back to in chat, and maybe you have a couple of other questions as well, but I wanted to wrap this up by bringing us back to my geography class in 3rd grade. So, one of the reasons that I said that I wanted to pass that test was to impress Julie, that cute girl in my class. And clearly I did not get the girl that day, right? So she was one of the kids laughing at me because I couldn't pick brown from green, for instance. So I didn't get the girl, but what I got that day was the understanding that there were such thing as injustices in the world, and there was a way to work towards that. To me, there's a really clear difference between my teacher, who represented society as a way of saying, you are broken, you have a problem, you need to go and fix that. And the way that she approached it, thinking I was the problem because I couldn't tell colors apart, is really a demonstration of what we call the medical model of disability, where basically, if you have a problem, you have to deal with it. You have to figure out a solution. You have to help yourself. We're not going to help you. And then the nurse, on the exact opposite of that, represents to me the social model of accessibility, where what we're saying is, you have this challenge, but you are not the problem. The problem is the environment around you. And if we make the environment around you accessible, if we make it inclusive, you will be able to perform, you will be able to succeed just like everybody else. And I wish that we all are more like that nurse and a lot less like that teacher. Because if my test in that particular day had been not about, British Columbia is brown and Alberta is green, and then every other province is that color. But instead, it had been, here are 10 provinces, pick a color for each one that you want and color that province with that color. I would have had 10 out of 10 because I knew what the provinces were. I just didn't know what brown was. And I was being tested on the wrong thing. I was not being tested on my ability to know the geography. I was being tested on my ability to differentiate colors. And that's pretty prejudicial to me because I was born unable to do that. So if we translate that into what we do every day, and you start thinking about how other people might experience what you're creating, you'll realize that there are more than one ways to do that. And one-size solutions never fit all. And as a result of that, we just have to educate ourselves about accessibility and understand how to do these different things so that less people are left out as a result of that. Thank you. Okay, so let me just go back a little bit. There were a couple of things that I noticed that I wanted to get back to. So someone asked me, so you're colorblind, does this thing affect you till now, and how can you deal with this? Well, it affects me every day. Like I mentioned, I mean, every time that I get on a website, on a brochure, anything that's visual, where information is conveyed through color, I can't quite know what that is. Imagine a pie chart. Imagine a pie chart of, your financial results for the entire year. And, the designer wanted to make that pie chart pretty. So all the colors are in this general hue of, blues and purples and violet and light blue. They all kind of look the same to me. Like, I don't know what they are. I mean, I can tell that some are darker, some are lighter, but I can't tell the difference between, say, navy blue and violet. It's the same thing to me. Purple and, dark blue are kind of the same as well. I definitely can't tell the difference between brown and green. Red and green, same thing. Brown and red, kind of, but, not great. So if I have to identify a color to be able to relate to a data point, I can't do that. If you have a link in a paragraph of text and the link is a different color and the color is too close to the color of the text, I'm going to miss it. If I'm stressed out, I'm going to miss it even more. So, things like that happen all the time. But, otherwise, I mean, living my life as someone who's colorblind is not really a problem. But when I need information, sometimes it can be. And then see what else do we have there. So what Rabab was saying, it requires a culture change and shift in mindset. It takes awareness, effort to change it in countries, definitely. Kareem said, instead of depending entirely on website designers to handle accessibility for people with disabilities, I think about creating software that helps. Well, good point. So, assistive artificial intelligence has been contributing a lot to making accessibility easier for folks, and that's only going to get better. I truly believe that a lot of the solutions for accessibility over time will come through technology, but there's a certain minimum that we have to assume as individuals to educate ourselves about that too, so that we can know how to use and leverage these technologies as best as we can. I mean, we're no longer in the point where we have to learn everything like, I had to 20 years ago, but it's going to be a long time before everything is built in by default in software. So we still need to learn a little bit about that. And then let's see, was there anything else in terms of questions? No, I think that was it. So again, thank you for your attention. Thank you for having me here. I'm happy to stick around for a little bit if people have questions. Otherwise, I'm going to bid you a great rest of your day and event at the hackathon. Ali has a question. Actually, Wissam has a question. So how do you think we shall approach visual impairments in websites and apps? Well, the very first thing that I would say, and maybe the most important recommendation, would be try to identify people who have these challenges. Try to identify someone who's blind and have them navigate your website using their tools and learn from what they tell you. That is by far the best advice I can give you. I mean, you can go and read WCAG 2.1 and look at different success criterion in there that speak to, visual impairments, blindness, low vision, for instance. You're going to get a sense of what you're supposed to do. As an example, you have images. These images need to have the alt text. They need to have a textual description, because if I can see the image, at least my software can read me what the description of that image is. Well, that's simple enough. If you're a coder, your IMG tag, you have an alt attribute, you describe the image in that alt attribute value. That's pretty straightforward. Or like I said, don't depend on color alone to convey information is another example of how you can make something a little easier for someone who's as a visual, like a color perception deficiency, like myself. There are a certain number of, recommendations like that. But the most important one is talk to your users. Talk to someone who has a vision impairment and learn from their experience, learn what their challenges are, and then make tweaks according to that, learn from those things. And before you know it, you'll be applying accessibility guidelines without even knowing, because what those folks know what they need. Those folks know the challenge that they run into every single day. If you give them a chance to tell you what they are, they will. And then you can learn from that and just start making these progressive changes into how you're building your content. And before you know it, you'll be doing some of that without even having to have read this documentation, because between you and me, it's not exactly an interesting read, right? I mean, it's hundreds of pages of technical information. It's really boring, but it's extremely important for the good of the world to do that. Because again, in your country, 22% of the population needs this to begin with, without even diving too deep into economics and everything, because I don't have that kind of information for you. But it's certainly a game changer. You're welcome. Yeah, so again, thank you for having me. Thank you for this opportunity. And you can definitely get a hold of me. I'm going to drop my email in chat if anyone wants to continue that conversation here. And you can find me on LinkedIn as well, and I'll be happy to connect with you if you want to do that.
Thank you so much, Denis. It was a great session. I love it, the way you introduced everything in a storytelling way, and I'm pretty sure everyone benefited. So do save the email and follow Denis on LinkedIn. I'm pretty sure you will learn a lot. Thank you so much, and thank you for the extra time that you give us.
Yeah, you're very welcome. Have a great rest of your day.
Have a great day. Bye. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.